Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure to have Professor Colin Humphreys with us today. Colin, who I've known for many years, is Professor of Material Science here at Cambridge University, though he's also worked in, I think, Liverpool and Oxford, the main places as well as those places. He's had a very long-standing interest in using biblical data and scientific data to try and tie down some of the factual things that happen in the Bible. Today he's going to be talking, as you see, about the Star of Bethlehem and the date of that. But he's also written on a number of other things, for instance on the date of the crucifixion, which remarkably was published in Nature, wasn't it? And Colin tells me that he had more correspondence from that paper than from any other. I think you had at least 500 letters about it. So I think that's really impressive, actually, because I know from trying just recently to get articles published in Nature, they reject a lot of papers. I think they reject 80% without even reviewing them that they get. So it's very hard to get into Nature, and it's very impressive that they are willing to look at historical facts like the date of the crucifixion.
So the Star of Bethlehem. This is a typical Christmas card, and if you took away the star, you probably wouldn't know it's a Christmas card because the trees are somewhat stylized. This is certainly not a Middle Eastern village, typical rural British countryside village. But you put this star there, and people just know it's a Christmas card. So this logo of the Star of Bethlehem is one of the best known logos or symbols in the world, recognisable by many, many people. Of course, it's been in the news very recently. This was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. He had a radio interview on the 19th of December this year, reported in the Times of the 20th of December, and this is what he said. The story of the three wise men is nothing but legend. There was scant evidence for the Magi. The chances of snow falling in Bethlehem were very unlikely. So here we get some factual statements, and we have to take these seriously, not only because he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, but because he's also a very scholarly person. And here's another statement. As for the star rising and standing still, the Archbishop pointed out that stars just don't behave like that. So there again, that's a factual statement, which seems very plausible, and we'll ask the question, is that true or not, in a moment. And then this is Ruth Ledhill, who's the religion correspondent of the Times. She said Dr. Williams was not saying anything which is not taught as a matter of course in even the most conservative theological colleges. I'm not sure if that's actually correct, but that's what she said and that's what she believes, and she's been a religious correspondent of the Times of some years standing. So that's some background. So this is a controversial topic, and you all know that most people believe the Star of Bethlehem to be a myth. Well, is it an important problem? Is it worth you being here at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning to listen to this? Well, to start with, it is very well known. It's a very well known story. What the Star of Bethlehem is has been a mystery really for 2,000 years. People have debated this, many attempts to solve. It's got, as Bob has said, it's got broader significance. If we can say what the Star of Bethlehem might have been, and we can date this event, then this may enable us to get some information about the date of the birth of Christ. The date of birth of Christ, of course, is relevant to the BC AD origin of our calendar. So BC stands for before Christ, AD Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of our Lord. And so we date the origin of our calendar to when we believe Jesus Christ was born. So that's how we date it, at least in the Western world. Let's now look at, after introduction, look at the evidence for some of the dates we hold. The traditional date of Christmas in the Western Church is December the 25th, of course. That's quite a late tradition. The earliest reference we have to December the 25th being Christmas is AD 336. So it's quite a late tradition. Almost certainly it's based on the Roman feast of Sol Invictus, which is the feast of the invincible sun, which was held on December the 25th, and Christians took it over. So the Christians thought this Roman feast, the invincible sun, on to December the 25th, because the shortest day is December the 21st or 22nd, and by the 25th you're pretty sure the sun really is, the days are lengthening. And so this was, the Romans said, the sun is being reborn. And so they celebrated the rebirth of the sun and called it the Feast of the Invincible Sun. And you can see why the Christians might take this over because of the symbolism. And then in the Eastern Church, they celebrate Christmas on January the 6th, and that celebrates another pagan festival of Kori. And then if we look at the actual BC AD origin of our calendar, that was fixed even later, in AD 525, by a Roman scholar and monk called Dionysius Exiguus. And he worked backwards from known dates and forwards from other known dates to try and fix the date of the birth of Christ. And he fixed the date of the birth so that the circumcision was on January the 1st, AD 1, and since Jews were circumcised 8 days, counting inclusively from their birth, it puts the birth on December the 25th. That's rather a nice coincidence, if you like. So that's how Dionysius Exiguus fixed the date, by going backwards and going forwards. He left some notes, but not many, right? So scientists should always leave decent notes. We're not quite sure who did these calculations. It is believed he may have forgotten a 4-year period when the Roman Emperor Augustus ruled under his own name Octavius. It's also believed he may have forgotten that in the historical calendar you go straight from 1 BC to AD 1. There's no year 0 in the historical calendar. So he may have been 4 or 5 years out, even if he'd done the other sums correctly. More recently, people have looked at the date of the Nativity, and we get this large range of dates. And someone else has analysed this. This is the dates of the birth of Christ in ancient sources and in modern sources. And these are the number of sources. So you see in ancient sources, the most popular date for the birth of Christ was 3 BC, and in modern sources, it's 7 BC. That's taken the origin as the Dionysius Exiguus date. So, no, 6 BC is the most popular date in modern sources, 3 BC in ancient sources. You can see this great spread of dates. So what are we to say about the Star of Bethlehem? Well, there's 3 main views. We've already heard the mythical view, and the majority of scholars, and certainly the majority of people, if you went out into the streets of Cambridge or where you live, they would believe the story is a myth. So that's the most popular view. There are some Christians who believe that this was a specially created object, so science can have nothing to say about it. God created this star for this event, it suddenly appeared, and then it disappeared, and it was some sort of miraculous object which wasn't part of the normal heavens at all. And then the third point of view is that it was a real astronomical object. And my belief is that if you look in ancient literature, and it can be ancient Christian literature, or Egyptian literature, or Babylonian literature, or Muslim literature, when you get celestial objects described in a historical sort of description, historical sense, then tentatively you should take this story literally and see if it makes sense. Because to do justice to the writer, you should really do that. If it doesn't make sense, then you can go on to say this story may be mythical, or perhaps a miraculous object beyond science. But to start with, I think your starting point should be, in any literature, in any ancient literature, is this a real observation? And there are observations of newly appeared stars in Egyptian literature and Babylonian literature. So that's what we're going to do. And it's going to be tentative. We're going to say, tentatively, does the story in Matthew's Gospel make sense? The Star of Bethlehem appears in the 2nd chapter of Matthew's Gospel. It's sandwiched between chapter 1, which is clearly meant to be historical. Chapter 1 is largely the genealogy of Jesus, where Matthew is fixing Jesus in history. Chapter 3 of Matthew's Gospel is largely about John the Baptist. So chapter 2 sandwiched between 2 chapters which are clearly meant to be factually based. The final text of Matthew's Gospel, most scholars believe about AD 60. It's actually extremely hard to date the Gospels. But whatever the final date of the text is, the Gospels, well, Luke's Gospel tells us are based on eyewitness sources, and all 4 Gospels are probably based on eyewitness sources. So in a sense, the final texts are not that important. So they're based on earlier sources. There is a tradition that the source for the birth story of Jesus is from Mary, the mother of Jesus. We don't know if that's correct or not, they just mention that is a tradition. So Matthew's Gospel tells us, and we'll read it in a moment, that Magi, we'll see who they are in a moment, saw a star in the east, which they believed heralded the birth of the King of the Jews. And that's the first question we can ask. Why, when you see a star in the sky, why should you think that heralds the birth of the King of the Jews? They then travelled to Jerusalem, and it's important to realise the Bible does not say at this stage they followed the star. In fact, you can infer the opposite, because the Magi, the Matthew Gospel tells us, were from the east, and they saw the star in the east. So the star was to the east of them, they were from the east. If they travelled to Jerusalem, they would have been going west, all right? So they weren't following the star, they were going, in fact, in the opposite direction to where the star was. And they went to Jerusalem because they thought the star heralded the birth of the King of the Jews, and so they thought the King of the Jews would be born in Jerusalem. So that's why they went to Jerusalem. They went to Herod expecting Jesus, or expecting the Messiah to be born there, and he wasn't born there, so he asked Herod where he was to be born. Herod asked his advisors. His advisors said, Old Testament prophecy, the King of the Jews will be born in Bethlehem. So they then went to Bethlehem, and what you need to know is that Bethlehem is due south of Jerusalem, and when they left Jerusalem, went to Bethlehem, they saw the star before them. So this star, which originally they're seen in the east, when they left Jerusalem, the star must have been in the south, because the star was before them. And then it stood over the place where the child was born, which many people think as pointing to a manger or a house, but it could just be interpreted more broadly. As they went from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, they saw the star pointing to standing over the place where the child was born. So standing over Bethlehem, which of course itself is hard to understand. Raymond Brown is one of, I think he died last year, he's a New Testament giant of a scholar. He's a Catholic scholar. He's one of the most respected scholars of New Testament. And this is what he writes about the Star of Bethlehem. You can see his command of language is very beautiful. He says, a star that rose in the east, appeared over Jerusalem, turned south to Bethlehem, and then came to rest over a house, would have constituted a celestial phenomenon unparalleled in astronomical history, yet it received no notice in the records of the times. So you see, he's just dismissed this in rather beautiful prose. And his arguments at first sight do sound very convincing. So we'll now investigate this further, and let's just look at this second chapter of Matthew's Gospel and just go through what Matthew is actually saying. So Matthew starts by saying, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, there are two Bethlehems. There's a northern Bethlehem, there's a southern one in Judea. So Matthew is pinpointing the particular Bethlehem where Jesus was born, so he's rooting the birth of Jesus in geography. And then he says, during the time of King Herod, so he now roots it in history, so he gets a time factor coming in. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. The Magi are introduced with no description at all. It is as if his audience would just know who Magi are, and we'll show that's the case in a moment. He doesn't need to say who they are, because at that time they'd be well known. He just tells us they came from the east to Jerusalem, and asks, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So this star they associated with the King of the Jews, for reasons which at the moment are not clear. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the distortion, this was actually a scanned-in Bible page. Called together the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler, who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. So he sent them to Bethlehem, because that is where the Old Testament prophet has said the King of the Jews, that the new King of the Jews would be born. So then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So that's another clue about the star. The star appeared at an exact time. It was a newly appeared star, according to Matthew. Before a certain time, the star was not there. After a certain time, the star was there. So it was a newly appeared star. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them. As we said, Bethlehem is due south, until it stopped over the place where the child was. So they're travelling towards Bethlehem, and so this phrase may mean the star stopping over Bethlehem. It might mean standing over a house, I agree, but it might mean standing over Bethlehem. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. So that's the description in Matthew's Gospel, and we can deduce a few key facts from it as we've gone along. But here's some questions the story raises. Who were the Magi, which are just introduced in Matthew's Gospel as if the audience would know? Is the story plausible? Well, at this stage it doesn't sound plausible, and for reasons that the Archbishop of Canterbury has said. Is there a known astronomical object which fits the story? Why did the Magi make their journey? And if we can answer all of those, maybe we can say something about the date of the first Christmas. So who were the Magi? Well, it turns out in ancient literature there are lots of references to the Magi, so they were well known. Herodotus, a very famous historian, he tells us that in 500 BC there were priests amongst the Medes. The Medes were a religious group of people, and there were a priestly group amongst the Medes whose specific role it was to interpret signs and portents. So these were priests who would, as it were, predict the future, and Herodotus tells us they existed in Persia in 500 BC. Persia, which we now call Iran, conquered Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq. So these wars have been going on a long time between Iran and Iraq. And when they did this, the Magi shifted the focus of where they lived to Babylon, and in 300 BC, Babylon was a major centre of astronomy and astrology. And in fact, until the 18th century AD, people did not distinguish between astronomy and astrology. The usual belief was that the stars were made for signs. So they studied the stars, they did astronomy, but they believed they were made for signs. So astrology was sort of built in as well. And also, if we go back to 586 BC, we know then the Babylonians came into Jerusalem, conquered Jerusalem, and took Jews in exile back to Babylon. And when Jews returned from Babylon back to Jerusalem, a colony of Jews also stayed in Babylon, we know that. The Old Testament book of Daniel talks about Magi there. If you look up Daniel, you'll find Magi referred to a number of times in Daniel's book. And so the Jews and the Magi in Babylon actually had close contact with each other, and so it's very likely that the Magi would know of the Jewish prophecies of a Saviour King. This shows an early 6th century mosaic in the church in Ravenna of the three wise men, sometimes depicted as three kings. Some people say this is the three kings. Of course, there's no indication in the Matthew's Gospel that they were kings. They were Magi, and the Magi were well known. This is Jerusalem. Here's Bethlehem, if you can see, just about 6 miles due south. This is where the Magi started from in Persia. They then spread to have their centre in Babylon. And after that, as we'll see in a moment, they actually spread into Arabia. So by the time of Christ, these Magi were occupying really quite a broad region of countryside. But what you can see is all to the east of Jerusalem. So when Matthew's Gospel says Magi came from the east, he was certainly correct, because this is where the Magi were. We know that from other sources, and we also know that he didn't need to introduce the Magi because they are well known. And here's some other sources. By 100 BC, the Magi spread out into Arabia. Philo tells us that astronomy was a core subject. We have core curricular subjects now. Where if you go back to the 1st century AD in Rome, then astronomy and astrology was one of the 5 core subjects in the curriculum. There's quite an early tradition, some of you will wish that's the case now, there's quite an early tradition that goes 96 AD, which is quite early. Clement of Rome, who's a great Christian scholar, he said the Magi who visited Jesus were from Arabia. And then in AD 160, another scholar, Justin Martyr, said Magi from Arabia came to Herod. So those are quite early traditions. And if you go into ancient literature, you'll find the Magi referred to many times. Here's a Roman historian, Tacitus and Suetonius, Dio Cassius, 3 Roman historians, all refer to the Magi. In AD 66, Magi visited the Emperor Nero, a whole column of them. They would almost certainly be paid for their prophecies, right? They visited the emperors and they foretold the future and they'd be paid for their prophecies. Josephus tells us that the Magi visited Herod in 10 BC, about 10 BC. So previously the Magi visited Herod. So these people really were well known. They were the sort of ancient fortune tellers of their time, but they did it for the kings. They were very well paid, they were very wealthy, so they could afford to bring these gifts. I mean, the unusual thing was that they brought gifts to Jesus. Normally, kings would give gifts to them. So that was the unusual thing about the story. Well, how long did the journey take? That's quite important, as we'll see in a moment. Wherever they travelled from, they almost certainly came on camels, because that was a normal mode of transport. Lawrence of Arabia in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom says that in 24 hours a camel covers 100 miles if hard pressed, and 50 miles comfortably. I said once before, if you've travelled on a camel, you will not use the word comfortably. So you can do, 50 miles in a day, I think, if you're lucky. How far did the Magi travel? Well, the furthest distance would have been from Persia to Jerusalem. That's 1,000 miles going across the Arabian desert. If they come via the Fertile Crescent, it's about 1,400 miles. So if you're going at about 50 miles a day or so, you can work that out. But the maximum journey time is about 2 months. It's much more likely that they came from Babylon or from Arabia, both of which are closer. If they came from Babylon, then in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar went to Jerusalem, and that journey took 23 days. We know that from Arabic literature. So we're looking, the journey time, probably 1 to 2 months, probably nearer 1 month than 2 months. But that's the sort of journey time of the Magi. So this is a summary. The Magi were well known. They're astronomers and astrologers from Arabia or Iraq or Iran, royal fortune tellers, high-class fortune tellers. Matthew says Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, and that statement we know to make sense, because that's where the Magi were. They were from the east of Jerusalem, and it would not have appeared unusual for them to do this because they had actually visited Herod before, and Josephus tells us it wouldn't have been unusual at all. And what I tried to do when I worked on this was to pretend I was one of the Magi. How did they think? Why did they undertake this journey? So you might like to do that. I'm very wise men and women here, so you can pretend, right, you're one of the Magi. Let's now go to the characteristics of the Star of Bethlehem. The first characteristic is it was a newly appeared star. Matthew chapter 2 verse 7 says, Herod ascertained from the Magi the exact time the star had appeared. The second characteristic is we can deduce this was a star which travelled slowly through the sky against the star background. And we can deduce that because the Magi first saw the star in the east. They travelled to Jerusalem. Herod sent to Bethlehem. The star they had seen in the east went ahead of them, which was south. So this star travelled through the sky from east to south in the time it took the Magi to travel from where they were living to Jerusalem, which we have just said was probably 1 to 2 months, probably nearer 1 month than 2 months. So that's a curious star that will do that. And the third characteristic of the star is really stranger. The star, how can a star stand over a place? This is what the Archbishop of Canterbury honed in on. How can a star stand over Bethlehem? The star went ahead of them and stood over the place where the child was. So those are the 3 characteristic features of the star in Matthew's Gospel, which if we're going to take it seriously, we have to have an explanation for. Well, here's some theories of the Star of Bethlehem. The most popular theory which you'll find demonstrated in planetariums around the world, is it was a triple conjunction of these two planets, Jupiter and Saturn, which we can calculate occurred in 7 BC. And let me just show what a triple conjunction is, and we'll come back to this in a moment. But here's the Sun, this is the Earth orbiting around it with the Moon, that's Jupiter, and that's the orbit of Saturn. And the orbits are such that every so often the Earth and Jupiter and Saturn line up in a straight line, and that's called a conjunction, when one planet is hidden behind the other planet. And in 7 BC, this happened 3 times. The planets came together and separated, came together and separated, came together and separated, because of the rather complex orbit of planets. So, that unusual event, a number of people say was the Star of Bethlehem. The earliest record we have that claims this is the 8th century. I ruled it out as a Star of Bethlehem for 2 reasons. Firstly, when you do the calculations, the planets never really come together as a proper conjunction. They come close, but never really overlap. And the second reason is that there's no way you can describe 2 planets coming together as standing over a place. That just doesn't work. The second theory of the Star of Bethlehem is that it was either a nova or a supernova, and Kepler is the first person, I think, to have said this, very famous astronomer. I think you can rule that out because indeed that's a newly appeared star, so it fits that bit of the information in the story, but it's fixed in the night sky. Novas and supernovas do not travel through the sky. A more recent theory, a book of Michael Molnar, suggests that it was a conjunction of the Jupiter and the Moon. So the Moon came in front of Jupiter, and that has some support amongst astronomers. It was a rather cleverly argued case. I mean, it turns out that this was not actually visible from Jerusalem when you do the calculations, and also how can that appear to stand over a place? So again, that's something I think we can rule out. And you can go through the various candidates, and I think there's only one possibility, and that is a comet. And the comet can be very bright. It's newly appeared in the sense that you see a comet at a certain day, and before that you couldn't see it, and after that you can see it. A comet also moves through the night sky at 1 to 2 degrees per day, so it does move. It can be seen twice, when it comes in and also when it goes out. Often it's only seen once. Let's just have a look at some cometary orbits. Some comets have an elliptical orbit like this. This is orbit of Halley's comet. And sometimes you see Halley's comet when it comes in. It's then lost in the glare of the sun, and you see it again when it goes out. Depends where you are on the Earth's surface. Sometimes you just see it when it comes in, sometimes when it goes out, and sometimes both. Comets can also have hyperbolic orbits and parabolic orbits where you just see them once and they never return. And if the Star of Bethlehem was a comet, we don't know whether it had an elliptical orbit and, as it were, will return or has returned, or whether it was just something which was seen once because it was parabolic or hyperbolic. So if it was a comet, then was it seen once or twice? So maybe if it was a comet, they saw this comet in the east when it came in the south when it left, and maybe they saw it twice. All the evidence we have from this period of time was if comets were seen twice, on the way in, then they disappeared, and on the way out, astronomers at the time did not know it was the same star. They always refer in ancient records to it being 2 different comets if they saw it coming in and then going out. This was clearly the same star, so we can deduce from that that they saw the comet either coming in or going out. Going out is more likely because it's then brighter. And I say it depends where you are on the Earth's surface if you see it once or twice. So probably they just saw it once going out, and so what was then happening was when the Magi started their journey in Jerusalem, the comet was in the east, came to Jerusalem, it was in the south, and so the comet had moved through 90 degrees in the journey time of the Magi, which was 1 to 2 months. Now, does this make sense? If the comet was fixed, a bit of astronomy, but not too difficult. If the comet was fixed in the night sky, then in the 1 to 2 months it took for the Magi to travel from where they lived to Jerusalem, because the Earth goes round the Sun in a year, in 1 month the Earth moves 30 degrees against the night sky, in 2 months it moves 60 degrees against the night sky. So the night sky appears to rotate because of that region. If the comet had gone through 90 degrees from east to south, then you need an extra motion of 30 to 60 degrees. Comets typically move 1 to 2 degrees per day, we know that, and so the extra journey time of the comet required is 1 to 2 months. And this agrees with the journey time of the Magi. Right? So it's very hand-waving. What we can say is a comet fits the bill for moving from east to south, because if you do the sums, and knowing that comets move 1 to 2 degrees per day, then a comet would indeed move 90 degrees in 1 to 2 months. Now this is the really difficult part. The star stood over Bethlehem. And one thing I did, I searched ancient literature for any references to stars standing over places. And I found 2 and only 2. And this is one of them. This is Dio Cassius in Roman history. And he writes about, this is what he writes. He writes, the star called Comet stood for several days over the city being Rome. So what Dio Cassius does here, he identifies the star as a comet, and he says it stood for several days over the city. We can do the calculations now to see what he was referring to, and he was referring to a comet in 12 BC, which was Halley's comet. It's one of the orbits, one of the times Halley's comet visited. So, and he uses this phrase, it stood for several days over the city. So the words he's using in the Roman literature are the same sort of words as Matthew's using in his Gospel, that this star stood over a place. So that's one reference to a star standing over a place. Here's the other reference I found from Josephus, writing in Jewish War. He says, a star resembling a sword stood over the city, and that city was Jerusalem. And if you go back in ancient literature, comets are frequently described as swords, and this is because of their curved tail. We'll see a photograph in a moment. Comets frequently have long curved tails, and they were described as swords. In ancient Egyptian literature and ancient Babylonian literature, there's an Old Testament reference actually to a sword in the sky, and a number of people think that's almost certainly a description of a comet. We can do the calculations again, and this is probably the comet. Well, I said calculations also ancient references in other literature, probably the comet of AD 64. So these are the only 2 references I can find in the literature to a star standing over a place. Both references refer to comets. And so we can deduce, I think, that when Matthew talks about a star standing over a place, then he also is referring to a comet. And here's a picture. This is a beautiful picture. It's called Donatis Comet over Paris in 1858. And you can see now why this star can stand over a place. Of course, where it stands over depends on the observer as well as on the comet, right? But now you're the observers, right here, and here's the comet, and and you have to have a long tail, otherwise it doesn't work. That's why the comet appears to stand over a place. And here you'll look at this, and if you're the observer, in layman's language, you would say this star is standing over Paris. And you might say it's standing over that building. Right, so comets are the only stars that can do this, and they really look as if they're standing over a place. Well, there's actually 2 reasons. One reason is the long tail. The other reason is that comets are usually seen low in the sky. So this comet, in fact, is way beyond, as it were, way beyond Paris, low in the sky, and so it's sort of hovering over buildings, as it were, when you see it. So that's Donatis Comet over Paris. Here's an ancient woodcut of a comet seen at Prague in 1577, and you can see again how it appears to be standing over, and this tail is pointing towards that cluster of buildings. And I wouldn't push Matthew that far, but you can certainly say the comet's standing over a place, and maybe over a cluster of buildings or even a building. And it's the observers that are walking due south to Bethlehem would have seen a similar effect. So meaning was stood over is because the upward tail points the comet to a place, and comets were believed to have very low orbits. And in fact, what Aristotle said was that comets were closer to the Earth than the Moon. All right? And people believe that comets work really close to the Earth, much closer to the Moon, and that was the case until, I think, was this? Yes, Tycho Brahe. He had this great observatory, and he showed they were far away, and it astonished people. He used parallax, right? Here's a parallax observation of a comet. So there's a comet coming past, they do some parallax observations, and they find out it's a lot further away than the Moon. That surprised the astronomers at the time, because it looks so close. And this is a rather fantastic drawing of Isaac Newton. That's King's College Chapel. This is a page of his original notebook, the comet of 1680, seen over King's College Chapel, and that's the drawing. And see how it's grazing the spires of King's College Chapel, right? The reality is it's way in the distance, but it's low on the horizon, and to the observer, that's what it appears to be doing. So, if we now look at what Raymond Brown said, you see that it actually, what he said, is not correct. That a star that rose in the east, appeared over Jerusalem, turned south to Bethlehem, and then came to rest over a house, was constituted a celestial phenomenon and paralleled in astronomical history. And that simply is not correct. It sounds correct, but we have examples from Dio Cassius of a comet over Rome, of Josephus of a comet over Jerusalem, and then this example in Matthew's Gospel. So that statement, and also the statements of the Archbishop of Canterbury, gosh, I must move on, and we can show are actually factually not correct. Yet it received no notice in the records of the times. We haven't yet dealt with that, so we must now come on to that. The earliest reference to what the Star of Bethlehem was actually suggests it was a comet. This is the earliest reference of the scholar Origen, writing in the 3rd century, and he says, the star that was seen in the east we consider to be a new star, such as a comet. All right, it doesn't actually say it was a comet, but that's the only type of star he mentions, such as a comet. There's a famous painting of the Italian painter Giotto in the Arena Chapel, showing the Nativity and a comet being there with its tail, and a number of paintings depict the Star of Bethlehem as a comet. Well, the question then which came to my mind really was, if the comet is the obvious solution, and I think it is, I think the standing over is a fingerprint, which shows it can't be anything else. If it's the obvious solution, why isn't it more widely accepted? And there's a very good reason for that. And this is the astronomer David Hughes, who wrote a book on the Star of Bethlehem, a very good book, which he rules out a comet, because he says their appearance was regarded as a sign from heaven of impending calamity and divine displeasure. So he says it couldn't possibly be a sign of the Star of Bethlehem, because symbolism was all wrong. And therefore, he says, the Magi would not have associated a comet with the Messiah. And at first sight, that makes a lot of sense. Here's a medal commemorating, if that's the right word, the Great Fire and Plague of London in 1666. And here you see these two comets on the medal, right? This calamity which occurred in 1666. This is a book, John Ezra books, 1684, a discourse on comets. And it says here, bring a brief resolution of I'll read it in modern English, a reasonable question whether the apparition of comets be the sign of approaching evil, right? That's one of the things this book sets out to show. And he says yes, he concludes comets are a sign of approaching evil. Here's a number of newspaper cuttings. In fear of comet, confesses murder. This is a man who murdered his wife many years previously. A comet is going to appear, and he gets terrified by this. He goes to the police and says, I murdered my wife many years previously, because the comet put this great fear into him. Excited over comet, a Montreal girl suddenly expired. Old Mother Earth in a comet's tail. World inhabitants influenced in various ways. Here's another California broadsheet in 1985. Behold, Halley's comet is coming, the end of mankind is near. Right? This is this death and destruction viewpoint. But if you look into history, what you find is that comets did herald bad, but they also heralded good tidings. And you see, if they were taken to predict the death of one king. Of course, that would also be the birth of another king. If a comet herald defeats in war, it would be victory for the other side in war. And in particular, there was a particular period of history where comets clearly meant good things and not bad things, and here's some examples. The Chinese called comets broom stars because of their long sort of bushy tail, as it were. And this is Chinese philosopher Choshu writing in about 300 BC. A comet is like a broom, it signals a sweeping away of evil. Isn't that wonderful symbolism for a comet at that time? In 44 BC, Julius Caesar died. A month after he died, a comet appeared in the sky. Emperor Augustus said, "This comet is taking away the soul of Caesar, but has appeared in my reign because this soul of Caesar, this godly soul, has been transferred to me." And Augustus then issued a coin with his head on one side and the comet on the reverse, because the comet symbolised the transference of the godly power of emperors from Caesar to him. So he clearly regards it as a good sign. Here's the Bayer Tapestry. This is Halley's Comet. That's Harold. Someone said to Harold, "Keep your eye open for arrows, Harold." And this is William. So, I mean, bad news for Harold, but good news for William. Who did the Bayer Tapestry? The French. All right, so for the French, the comet was good news. This is a particularly remarkable historical event. This was Mithridates, the famous king of Pontus, and the 2nd century historian Justinius said, "Heavenly phenomena had also predicted the greatness of this man, for both in the year he was born and in the year in which he began to reign, a comet shone through both periods 70 days. So Justinius is saying this man was a very famous king because the comet appeared when he was born and also when he began to reign. And if you go back in history, historians did not believe this. They said, this is just not possible, it's not plausible, it is a myth. Right? And then the Oxford astronomer Fodron came along, and he calculated, and he went back into ancient literature, I should say rather. He went back to ancient literature. He looked at Chinese records, and he found that there were comets in 134 BC and 120 BC, and these were the dates of the birth of Mithridates and the date in which he became king that historians believed in anyway. And so now if you read modern history books, these comets are cited as justifying the chronology. So because of Fodring, things have flipped. We know these comets happened. This is now taken to be a factual historical statement. Well, these are the Chinese records. The Chinese recorded comets and other celestial phenomena very carefully because they believed they were for signs. This is from the Han Dynasty, which was the dynasty at the time of Christ. Fortunately, it's been translated. In the period 20 BC to 10 AD, that's the possible, widest possible time span for the birth of Christ. The Chinese recorded 3 comets. One in 12 BC, that was Halley's Comet, and they describe this as a Po comet, and that means a comet with a short tail. Comet in 5 BC, seen for over 70 days, that's a Sui comet, and that means a comet with a long tail. Another comet in April 4 BC, a Po comet with a short tail. The only comet which would satisfy standing over a place is one with a long tail. You have to have a long tail or else it doesn't work. So the 5 BC comet is in fact the only comet in this time period which satisfies. So scientifically it's very, very satisfying. We have a unique solution. We have one comet and only one comet visible in this period with a long tail. Well, what about the dating? What's the earliest date of the birth of Christ? I'm sorry, I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Luke's Gospel tells us John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. A very precise reference. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to interpret because we're not sure what calendar Luke was using for the 15th year. Was this using a Jewish calendar or a Roman calendar? And then also there were actually 2 Jewish calendars and 2 Roman calendars. But if we take the earliest possible one, then the earliest possible date is autumn AD 28. Luke 3:23 says that Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry. I'm told the words about 30 are almost deliberately imprecise. So about It's rather striking. Here we have this precise description of when John started his ministry, this imprecise description when Jesus started his ministry, which is rather curious. But about 30 means, in the Greek, 30 rather than 20 or 40. Right? It is that imprecise, about 30. So if we say that the maximum about 30 can mean is 34, and we subtract 34 from 28, this gives us the earliest date for the birth of Christ to be 7 BC. Right? These two statements you can't get earlier than 7 BC. So in any case, we can rule out this 12 BC comet, which had a short tail. If we look at the latest date for the birth of Christ, then Herod the Great was ruling, and the Magi came to see him. Most scholars believe Herod the Great died in March 4 BC. There is some debate about that, but that's what most scholars believe. So this short tail comet of April 4 BC we can rule out. And so just on historical grounds, there's one possible solution only, and that is this comet of 5 BC. And that's the only comet in this period with a long tail. And this is what the Chinese records say. It occurred in the second year of the Chengping reign period, that was a Chinese emperor. It occurred in the second month of the Chinese year, which is March 9 to April 6, 5 BC. And this comet appeared in a place called Qianyu, which is a region of the sky, for over 70 days. Qianyu corresponds to what we now call Capricornus. Unusually, there's a footnote in the Han Dynasty records for this comet. Normally there are no footnotes. Here there's a footnote. And this is what the footnote says. Sui, that's the long-tail comet, are the means of eliminating the old and inaugurating the new. Right, so this is what the Chinese astronomers believed. Qianyu is a place where the 5 planets arise, origin of calendrical reckoning, starting point of 3 standards of computation. Right? We won't go into that, it's an important place. The appearance of the Sui, that's the long-tail comet, was a sign of change. The long period of its appearance, so over 70 days, was due to the importance of the incident to come. So that's what it really, they added this because this comet was really significant to the Chinese. And so they had this footnote, really important incident to come, and inaugurated the new. And this is the region in the star system, Capricornus, where the comet first appeared. So, and it's 70 days. Well, this comet, you can't see every comet from any place on the world. So the first question is, was this 5 BC comet visible from Arabia and Iran, and Iraq and Iran? The Chinese tell us where it appeared, which is in Capricornus. We can then do the calculations, and what we find is that in March, April of 5 BC, Capricornus became first visible in the east from Arabia at about 2 AM onwards. So Capricornus was below the horizon, at 2 AM it rose above the horizon, and the comet being seen in Capricornus would have risen above the horizon in that early morning sky from 2 AM onwards. And that fits precisely what Matthew says, they saw his star in the east. So this comet would have been seen to the east of the Magi. The comet was visible for 70 days, the Chinese record. That's consistent with the journey time of the Magi from 1 to 2 months. If the comet had only been visible for 5 days, it just wouldn't have worked. You need that time for the comet to move from east to south through 90 degrees or 1 to 2 degrees per day. So we've got a consistent story where the comet was first seen in the east in the morning sky. It then travelled outwards, going from east to south to west, which is a known orbit of the comet. The Magi travelled in 1 to 2 months. They saw the comet to the south before them as it travelled from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and then it became invisible after about 70 days, according to the Chinese. So, I really must speed up now. Key question, if the comet was the star of Bethlehem, why did it cause the Magi to make their journey? And this is where I believe we must return to Saturn and Jupiter in 7 BC. And because I think there were 3 very unusual astronomical events. There was a triple conjunction in 7 BC, there was a massing of 3 planets in 6 BC, there's this comet in 5 BC. The triple conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, there's a wonderful book written in the 8th century by an Arabian astronomer called Masha Allah. The book was called Of Conjunctions, Peoples and History, that's a great title, based on an early Babylonian theory, and he said, conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter predict major world changes, and he said in the 8th century, there were these conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn for the flood, the birth of Christ, the birth of Muhammad. I don't know how we know that, it may be a guess, but that's what he said. If you do the calculations, this is the separation, the angular separation of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC and 6 BC. There's a calculated results. So the angular separation starts at 8 degrees, it comes very small, about 1 degree, and that's the first conjunction. They separate again, come together again, that's the second one, separate a bit, come together again, that's the third conjunction. But they're never seen as one. That's the full moon on the same scale. So they're always separated by more than the diameter. They come very close, but never really overlap. That's a triple conjunction, and it would have been a very striking sight in the night sky. We know from Magian astronomy, we know from Babylonian astronomy what the Magians would have believed. Saturn represented the Divine Father. Jupiter was his son. This triple conjunction was of a backdrop of Pisces in the sky. So here's a diagram. There's the Earth, Jupiter and Saturn in line, and we can calculate that when you look beyond that, to the stars beyond, this was in Pisces. And that had great significance because Saturn and Jupiter coming together and separating, the significance of that would have been a son, Jupiter, was being born. Son of God was being born. Pisces represented Israel in Babylonian astronomy. So they mapped the night sky on the Earth. So different regions of sky correspond to different regions on the Earth. Pisces represented Israel. So the significance of Saturn and Jupiter coming together in Pisces would have been a son of God is being born in Israel. And that, I think, was that's why the Magi were alerted that this was going to happen. Now you may well say, this is just total nonsense and myth. How do we know the Magi had any interest in this event at all? Well, as it happens, we do know, because this is what's called the Star Almanac of Sippar. Sippar is 30 miles north of Babylon, and this records the triple conjunction. It's recorded in such a way, it's a prediction for the year. And we actually don't know if that's right or not. It may have been, because they were clever astronomers, these people. And so they may have predicted this for the year ahead. That's how it's recorded. It's an almanac. But otherwise it's written after the event. But either way, we know it was important. Sadly, this is in the British Museum. Sadly, it's broken, so we don't know what else they might have recorded. But we know this was important because they recorded it. In 6 BC, another unusual event occurred. Mars joined Jupiter and Saturn in the sky, and so we've got this massing of 3 planets. And this was another tradition, that this would precede the birth of Christ. This was Jacob von Speyer asking Regiomontanus, who was the court astronomer. He said, given that the appearance of Christ is regarded as a consequence of the grand conjunction that's coming together, the 3 superior planets, that's Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, find the year of his birth, Regiomontanus could not calculate that, but Kepler later came along and did calculate it, and these are the 3 planets coming together very close in the sky in 6 BC, and that's what Kepler calculated. And Kepler said this massing of planets coincides with great historical events, and Kepler calculated massing of planets occurred in that date, that date, that date, that date, that date, that date. And he said, this is when Moses was. We now know that is probably not correct. That's when Isaiah was. That's pretty close, I think. That's when Kepler said Christ must have been born, when the massing was. That's when Charlemagne was. That's true. The Reformation. And for your interest, the next massing is in 2009 AD. So this was regarded as significant, and it would have been regarded as significant to the ancient Babylonians. Mars was the great celestial warrior, the mighty planet. So this king would have been a mighty king. I really must speed up now. So the scene is set. What has happened is there's been this triple conjunction which has told the Magi, in their understanding, a son of God will be born in Israel. 7 BC. 6 BC is going to be a mighty king. The question is when. And this is the third and final sign. What you need to know is the significance of comets. And Ptolemy records this. He says a comet in the Orient signified a rapidly approaching event. A comet in the Occident, an event that approaches more slowly. The Orient is the East. And Matthew specifies they saw his star in the East. So it was a rapidly approaching event. And so this is my theory of what happened. They were primed that this great event was going to happen. They then saw the comet. It's rapidly approaching. So that's the priming. That's the star which gets them to jump on their camels and make their journey. Right, I'll now speed up significantly. There's great significance in the comet appearing in Capricornus, which we won't go into because of time. We've got this remarkable sequence of events. Oh, but this is worth going into a little bit. Herod ordered the killing of all boys in Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under. Why the 2 years? According to the time he had learned from the Magi, is what Matthew's Gospel says. Now, the Magi would have told him everything. They would have told him the whole story. They would have said, there's a comet appeared, which Herod could see in the sky, but they would have said the whole thing started when they had got this triple conjunction of the planets, and that was in 7 BC. The whole thing started in 7 BC, and then we had Mars joining the planets and so on. And so I think Herod, leaving nothing to chance, went back to 7 BC. And so he killed all these boys. So that would fit with the 2 years and under. The birth of Jesus. Well, the birth of Jesus, if you accept this story, could not have been before the comet first appeared. And in Chinese records, that's the earliest date. The Chinese give us a month. That's the earliest date of the month. So 9 of March, 5 BC. There's a sequence of events we can go through. We can say when the latest date, the Magi would have seen the star at Bethlehem. We can calculate, I'm skipping this, calculate the latest date for the birth. But basically, we can say the date of first Christmas, if you accept this theory, was sometime in the region, 9 March to 4 May BC, not December the 25th. Now it's interesting, Luke says there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flock by night. And we know from today and also ancient records, in Bethlehem, sheep are not kept in the fields in December, January and February because of snow. Bethlehem is high up on a hill and it snows there and the sheep are kept indoors. That happens today, and from quite ancient records, that's happened in the ancient past as well. The sheep are actually put out to grass from March to November, and the lambing season is March to April. So when the shepherds would be watching their flocks is in the lambing season, particularly in March to April. And so this clue from Luke suggests that Jesus was not born at Christmas, but in the spring. This is a plot of temperature and rainfall in Jerusalem throughout the year. I can't find anything similar for Bethlehem. You can see November, you're getting down to 40 degrees in Jerusalem, and Bethlehem is higher up than Jerusalem. So it does snow regularly in Bethlehem. I've been in Jerusalem in Christmas with a snow blizzard, and I almost missed my flight from Tel Aviv. So Luke says about 30 when he starts his ministry. The most likely date for the baptism of Jesus was AD 29. If he was born in the spring of 5 BC, remembering there's no near zero, then Jesus would actually have started his ministry at 33, which corresponds to Luke's about 30. So 5 BC fits other dates we can deduce from the Bible. So the time of the first Christmas, evidence of astronomy, the Bible, ancient literature, we can suggest, I think it was that sort of period. I suggest it was this period because you can calculate when Passover was in 5 BC, and that was April the 20th, and people arrived for Passover a week before. Passover feast was a week long. Why was there no room for the inn? It would fit Passover very well, when people stayed in Jerusalem in all the surrounding places. So that would be a reason for there being no room at the inn. So we can, I believe, account for Matthew in some detail. I suggest the comet was, Star of Bethlehem was a comet in 5 BC, preceded by these two other events. Jesus was then born in the spring of 5 BC, and the event really was of cosmic significance. That this star, one of the reasons having it in the sky, if you like, was that this really was an event of cosmic significance. God's in charge of the universe with perfect timing, and that the pagan Magi realised this. One of the first people to worship him were Gentiles, and not Jews. And we can, of course, look back at this interview. There was scant evidence of the Magi. That's a very strange thing. Ancient literature is full of references to the Magi. Chances of snow falling in Bethlehem are very unlikely. In Christmas, that's just not true. Every Christmas time, snow falls in Bethlehem. And stars do rise above the horizon, and they can appear to stand over a place. So again, that just seems not to be correct. And so that's, I think, the final slide here. So I think, I hope I've convinced you that Archbishop of Canterbury may not be right. And there is a consistent story we can put together. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. We've got plenty of time for questions. Just while you're gathering your thoughts, let me ask an obvious one. That maybe why the Magi did not come at the moment of birth, and the reason that Herod had up to 2-year-olds killed is that they came up to 2 years later than Jesus' actual birth, and the fact they were living in a house and settled maybe would be evidence of that. How would you address that?
Right, I think the sequence of events suggests that Jesus was still. I mean, that is a good question, but you can't be for sure. But I think the sequence of events, if you put Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel together, maybe I can flip that. The sequence of events sort of fits in this sort of way. So the birth of Jesus, time of purification of 40 days, visits to the temple, return to Bethlehem, and then visit of Magi. Okay, you may be right, but you would, if you think of the symbolism, you would expect, if you're going to do the symbolism and get the timing right, you'd actually expect the star to be there when's the birth, I think. But I do not necessarily so.
Is that 2 years of killing?
There is a 2 years.
Killing infants is a pretty serious thing, isn't it?
Yes, but Herod was pretty ruthless.
He was pretty nasty man, wasn't he?
That's right, and he killed a lot. I mean, he killed, I think, 3,000 Jewish people who didn't pay him homage. And Bethlehem was a small village, so the number of infants killed would be relatively small.
I think the Archbishop of Canterbury may well be wrong, and clearly isn't an expert on astronomy. On the other hand, the evidence that Jesus was born in Bethlehem is very slender. He was, after all, from Nazareth. But Micah tells us about Bethlehem, the land of Judah, are not least. So what I thought Luke was doing and what Matthew are doing is saying something absolutely wonderful happened. And you may be quite right about the comet. What I'm suggesting is that what's important is that Jesus came on earth. Your account sounds very plausible to me about the comet. But, like most science, it's subject to falsification. And were it to be falsified, it would not worry me in the least, because I would still feel that Jesus, whether he was born in Bethlehem or in Nazareth, whether it was 5 BC or 180 or whatever, it was still a significant event. And the danger, I think, sometimes with the relationship between science and Christianity is that Christians get themselves tied into bits of science, and when other scientists falsify that bit of science, some Christians feel disillusioned, and they should. There are all sorts of fiddly details which we will either get right or get wrong. Great significance is the incarnation.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think we must not look, not see, not westward for the trees or something. That's right. And so the key point is that Jesus came or was born on earth, and that is the key point. And so I very much agree with that. I mean, I would add to that though. I would say that if you're not careful, also, your faith becomes a rather wishy-washy faith, not based on any evidence. And so if you can pinpoint certain events in the life of Christ, I think that does improve the historical basis of the Christian faith. And I think the I mean, I agree, the comet theory may not be right. I think it was observed by the Chinese, so in that sense, it's not a science theory which can be disproven. In the sense there was a comet in 5 BC with a long tail, which fits the description in Matthew and seems to be the right sort of time. So it's not 100% proof at all, but it's very plausible, as you say. And I think if you can reconstruct and put dates on, I just digress for 1 minute, and this is actually how I got started in this whole thing. My father gave my daughter a book called Great Men of History. Right? Now today it would be called Great Persons of History, but then it's called Great Men of History. Right? And the front, it had a page of each person, right? And it had Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and so on. And on the front page, it just listed the people in the book. And it gave their dates of birth and dates of death. And Jesus, it said, born 4 BC, question mark, died AD 30, question mark. And that was the only person in this list that had question marks against date of birth and death. Now I'm sure actually some of the others, should have had question marks, but they didn't. And in fact my daughter said, Daddy, why don't we know the dates for Jesus? And I thought, that if you can pinpoint these dates a bit, that really does help to improve the historicity of our beliefs. But I agree, the key thing is that Jesus came and was born as a son of God. I believe that is the key thing, that's right.
Right to the back.
I've got to quickly get this question in because we're off to church, but is there any evidence to suggest that this fits in with the census that Joseph would have been going to register in his own town? Is there any evidence of that?
Yes, the census is a problem. It's a well-known problem. There is a possible solution, which may not be the right solution. This is a 5th century AD historian, so it's sometime after the event, which says that there was a census of registration, right? So he says that what happened was that the Roman emperor had a census in which people registered their allegiance to him, and this was throughout the Roman Empire, so it wasn't a taxation census. And then Josephus appears to refer to a similar event in which he then refers to, and I just mentioned this, 3,000 Jewish people being killed because they did not pay allegiance to the emperor. And if you try and date that census from Josephus, it would have been about 5 BC. So, but the whole thing is problematic, but that is a possible solution. And one of the things, of course, we have to remember is that there's just a lot we don't understand about this period of time. And I think a lot of the problems, or some of the problems, might disappear if we knew more about what was actually happening in the 1st century AD. So, difficult problem, but possible solution. The historian's called Orosius, I just remembered, Orosius.
Yes, so there is a reference to the star in the Old Testament, isn't there? Is it in Numbers or Deuteronomy? You didn't mention that, and I wonder how significant that is.
That's right, a star will come out of Jacob and a sceptre out of something like that, yes. I didn't mention that. I think I didn't mention it because Matthew doesn't mention it. Not from the New Testament says, as fulfilling the prophecy. But yes, there is a reference. I think that's important.
And would the Magi, Judah the Magi would have known that reference, wouldn't they? They'd have known Jewish scriptures from the time of the exile.
They may have done, yes, they may have done. I think they would have known about Messiah. Whether they knew Jewish scripture, I just don't know, but they may have done. I mean, they are clearly very well, widely read and very educated people.
Yep, go to the front, please.
Are you not surprised that the shepherds, in very dark skies at the time, didn't themselves notice the comet, albeit as ordinary shepherds they might not have appreciated the significance? But surely they would have noticed this thing?
Yes, I think they may not have realised its significance. I mean, they saw the heavenly host. What that might not, not sure what that might have been. It might have been some bright things in the sky. I think we're told the story of the Magi, what they saw, and the Magi could interpret this. I think I think the shepherds would not have had knowledge to interpret things. I mean, shepherds would have seen shooting stars, and they would have seen this bright sky and not known what it was. And I think Herod saw this bright object and didn't know what it was.
Although it could also be support for this chronology, couldn't it?
Yes.
But the Magi came considerably later than the shepherds, so
That's
actually the prophet wasn't
true.
there when the shepherds were there,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
the interesting thought.
That is interesting.
Let's just have a new question and wait.
You mentioned that the Chinese kept records of the comets, and this long-tailed comet could be the Star of Bethlehem. Is there any records of this comet returning, or has it been recorded since?
Right, so that's a good question. We don't know. So basically, to know the orbit of the comet, you have to have 3 different observations at different periods of time. And the Chinese records only say where it started. So that's all we know. So we don't know whether it was an elliptical orbit or not. If we knew what its orbit was, we could say we could have calculated when it returned. As I say, some comets, it's a conic section of those. But I mean, some comets are hyperbolic or parabolic, and then they just don't return at all. They just come in once, and then that's it. And we don't know what sort of orbit it was.
Just going back to your question about the, excuse me, the 2 years and growing up in church, that's what we always hear. And I was just wondering as to the evidence for that. Is it just because of Herod killing all the infants that were 2 years old, or is there more beyond that?
Right. Yes. I mean, I think it's a good question whether Magi came a lot afterwards. I think another reason for thinking they may not have come 2 years afterwards was that if you accept the biblical story, then Joseph and Mary just went to Bethlehem, for this census, whatever it was, and then I think they would have left, soon afterwards, and they would have gone back to Nazareth, but they were warned, not to get into Egypt because Herod wanted to kill them. So that may be evidence that the Magi came, pretty close to the birth. Yeah.
Just going back to the census, I wonder whether there's any likelihood that we'll unearth in the future some definite mentions of the census. You would think if it's such a big historical event that it would have been recorded somewhere.
We know when this is the census. We know when the censuses for taxation purposes were because they were recorded in the Roman literature, and we know that the dates don't fit what the Gospels say, and there's also a problem with Quirinius as well. But this other explanation of a census for paying allegiance to the Roman emperor. We don't have any records of that apart from this late historian called Erosius who refers to it. And his reference does tally, it would seem, with what Josephus says. But I agree, documents are turned up all the time, like Dead Sea Scrolls all the time. Like Dead Sea, from time to time, like Dead Sea Scrolls, and so evidence might come.
Just come back with yours.
I wonder if anyone here knows what the Greek is for the bit about the emperor ordered everyone, the whole world should tax, because the Vulgate gives quod tota orbis discriminator, that is, that the whole world should be described, and that doesn't necessarily mean taxation.
No, you're right, yes.
But I don't know Greek, but I think it may be that one has this idea of Joseph going down to Bethlehem because Michael had foretold that the Saviour would be born, and what the Gospel writers are trying to do is say, here is the Messiah. As it happened, they lived in Nazareth, and it's not terribly plausible that an organisation like the Roman Empire would require people to go to the town that a distant ancestor of 1,000 years earlier came from, because he was of the house and lineage of David. So, I mean, if I could trace my lineage, as I cannot, back to the time of William the Conqueror, you imagine Gordon Brown now saying, let's have a census, and you've got to go back to where your ancestors were living at the time of William the Conqueror. Now, I don't think it matters in the least, but I do think that what the Gospel writers had to do at the time they were writing is say, the prophecy is fulfilled. Well, if there's a prophecy saying, Bethlehem, you shall be in Bethlehem.
Right. I mean, I think the taxation. I think, so I did look into this, that certainly the best manuscripts don't refer to taxation. They refer to a census, but they don't refer to taxation. So that's something which is either in other manuscripts that have been inserted.
Could there not be a sorry? I was going to say, could there not be a darker plot here? The Magi visited 10 BC. That could have been to say about the whole thing's going to happen. And Herod calls the census to try and make a first capture. And when they don't get any registration of the youth, because the child is only then born, it's their timing is out of prediction. So the census was really to try and capture the child.
Yeah, I think yes, darker plot. No, I think the my understanding is that these were royal fortune tellers who normally, like fortune tellers paid today, normally give you good news and then you're paid more, right? So I think when they the chance when they visited Herod in 10 BC, they give him good news. I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
but then he misses it. Yes, then the timing is out.
Can I just clarify something? I thought you were saying that the comet signified something which still had to happen.
A rapidly approaching event.
Right. But the Magi, according to this, weren't there until long after the birth of Jesus. So how could the star be foretelling the birth of Jesus when they came? The birth of Jesus had happened more than 40 days before that.
Right. They saw, yes, I mean, the star was visible for 70 days, and the interpretation of a comet in the east was a rapidly approaching event, so I think the Magi would then jump on their camels. But, we've got, this would have been relatively, going to the temple and going back to Jerusalem, you're just, I think, 6 miles away, so you would do that rather
Yes,
rapidly.
you've got the 40 days.
You've got a 40-day
between the birth and the visit
yes.
of the Magi. So
Yes.
the star couldn't have been pointing to the birth of Jesus at the time the Magi went there.
No, but originally the star was in the east, and then the star travelled round to be ahead of them in the south.
Yeah.
So that happened in 1 to 2 months.
Yeah.
So it would have been actually in the south and then hanging over Bethlehem, 1 to 2 months after they set out. So it would sort of fit this time scale, I think.
But not at the time they went there. Not at the time
No, when
they saw it standing.
Yeah, so when
later.
Yeah, so when they started, the star was to the east of them.
Yes, but when they saw it standing over Bethlehem,
Yes.
that was much later.
That was much later. That was when they left Jerusalem. That
And
was
later
right.
than the birth.
No,
Much
later than the birth.
Yeah, but they could conceivably have seen, on your timescale, the comet would have appeared at about the time of the birth, because it took them a month or two to get there. So it's the appearance of the comet, not the standing still, which is the
Yes,
portentous
right. Yes.
thing on that
Yes.
schedule.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering,
Well, sorry, could I just go back? But then it doesn't pinpoint. Sorry, what I was coming up to was you gave the date of the birth as the date when the Magi saw the comet standing. No?
No, I think.
Or have I misunderstood?
No, I went through that very, very rapidly. I basically looked at the latest date for the Magi see the star at Bethlehem, the latest date for the birth. The comet would have first appeared in a Chinese month, which started on the 9th of March.
Right.
So that's when the earliest date for the comet to appear.
Yes.
And I suggested that the birth was probably from 13th to 27th of April, so significantly after when the comet... Sorry, I'm now getting confused. The comet first appeared in March, April 5 BC.
Yes.
and I'm suggesting that the birth of Jesus was in probably 13th to 27th April, that time period.
But isn't that the time when you're suggesting the Magi went?
No, the Magi went after that.
After that?
Yes, yes. Yes, so I'm suggesting it took the Magi 1 to 2 months from when they first saw the star.
Yeah. I'm wondering, how is it possible for, if the Magi are supposed to be trained good astronomers or astrologers, so they fail to detect the difference between a star and a comet, while the Chinese astronomers, they could have the detail of this, the appearance of the sky to be a comet-like thing, sweeping, but the Magi couldn't detect or have any detailed form of the appearance of the star. So
Right. Okay. No, I think, right, the question is, good one. The question is, why does Matthew's Gospel describe the Magi talk about the star and the star appearing? I think the Gospels, the Gospels are written by non-scientists for non-scientists, and I think even today, most people looking up at the sky and seeing a comet, they would say, that's a star, right? So I think, I agree. I mean, the Magi, I believe they would know it was a comet because they were experts, but when Matthew's Gospel is describing what they saw, Matthew's Gospel describes it as a star. I mean, it's even possible that most of the readers of Matthew's Gospel didn't know what a comet was. Maybe that was the intelligentsia. But I mean, it was written for the common people in the world, and we would today describe a comet as a star. Many people here, or many people in England. Yeah. So that's a language that was just used to describe it. Yes.
I'm just wondering, at the same time, I mean, Indian astronomy was quite developed. Have you had similar literature? Have we any kind of source there in about the star?
In other literature?
Yeah, I mean, Indian astronomy was quite well developed before that even, and is there any literature in there?
No, that's a really good question. I've tried to look into that, and what I've been told is a lot of Indian astronomy is still being, the ancient astronomy is still being catalogued. So there's a lot of, whereas the Chinese is well documented, I'm told a lot of the Indian ancient astronomy, which exists, but still hasn't been catalogued very well, so it's not very accessible. And so that'd be very interesting to look at, I agree. I mean, the other thing is, there's only certain parts of the Earth you would see this coming from, not from, maybe it wasn't visible from India, but you could easily do the calculations to see, but to actually look in the Indian astronomical records would be a good thing to do.
Should we take one last question, then we'll stop for coffee?
What errors have you got on the calculations with the calendars?
It
seems to me the calendars are quite complicated to go back in the language.
Yes, right. So the question is, what are the errors with the calculations of calendars? And calendars are quite complicated. That is true. We can have quite a lot of confidence. Basically, just trying to think what question is easiest to answer. I mean, if you look at the Jewish calendar, which was at the time was an observational calendar, so the first day of the first month is when the first crescent moon was observed, we can now calculate that with considerable confidence. Much more than 90% confidence. The problem, what you can calculate with great confidence is what's called conjunction, and so that's when the sun and the moon are in line. And so there's a period of time, all right, you see the old moon fade away, and then you see the new moon come. There's a period of 2 or 3 days when you don't see the moon at all. And the middle of that precise interval we can calculate with considerable confidence. What it's harder to calculate is when people first saw the faintly glowing lunar crescent, but we can now do that with a lot of confidence using visual perception criteria and so on. So, yeah, more than 90% that the calendar reconstruction is right.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. That's been fascinating.